The new neighbors on Long Street are having a devil of a time blending in.
They're not called the angels from heaven or the community angels or the guardian angels. No, they're called Hell's Angels.
The NYPD painstakingly scours the 49th precinct to obtain video surveillance from homes, commercial buildings, from MTA buses, to follow this blue Jeep.
The afternoon of May 2nd, 2020 was like any other day for the inner city borough of Allerton in the Bronx. It was 3 p.m. and people were driving in and out of the busy area, and included among them was 51-year-old Francisco Rosado, aka Gunz, a property owner in Allerton who was standing outside his home on Holland Avenue with another man. The people in Rosado's vicinity knew who he was. His full-time, 24/7 life revolved around his involvement as a senior leader within the Pagans Motorcycle Club, an outlaw one-percenter bike club that was founded in Maryland decades ago and stretched across the East Coast over the decades. The Pagans were, as described by undercover ATF supervisor Ken Croke, a violent gang made up of extortionists, meth dealers, gang rapists, and addicts who killed and committed acts of violence without care and had little regard for their living conditions or appearances. And Rosado displayed his role as the leader of the gang's Bronx cell proudly, not just by his clothes and patches, but by the dozens of prison tattoos that covered his entire body and face. Little did he know, he'd been marked for death by his rivals within the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club for a shooting that had taken place almost half a year earlier. The Hells Angels and Pagans were at war across the coast, and nowhere was as apparent as New England, namely New York and New Jersey. As Rosado stood outside the residential property, a blue Jeep drove up across the street, and out of the car stepped gunmen Sayanon Tongtawath, aka Andy, and Frank Tatuli, aka Loose Cannon. Then, in broad daylight, the Bronx would suffer from another violent shooting that left Rosado dead on the sidewalk in front of several witnesses. It was a shooting that shook up the underworld, and was the result of months upon months of pent-up hatred and planning over loyalty to biker patches that club members saw as above all laws. More shootings were to come in the following few months as the two motor gangs turned the serene, working-class towns of New York and New Jersey into a war zone. This is the story of New York's vicious biker club wars, and the lasting impact they've had on the region for the past 6 decades.
The shooting occurred just before 2 a.m. while Trooper John Jacobs was frisking a suspect he'd stopped on a speeding charge. State troopers spent most of the day here at the scene along Route 42, 4 to 5 miles south of Deptford in Camden County, trying to piece everything together. The suspect apparently pulled a .38 caliber revolver, shot Jacobs in the face with the bullet lodging along the spine and cracking a vertebrae. Jacobs also emptied all 6 rounds from his gun, but it isn't known yet if he wounded his assailant. Despite that, by midday, state police had issued a warrant for the arrest of this man, 31-year-old Glenn Turner, reportedly the vice president of the Pagan Motorcycle gang, with felony convictions on weapons and drug charges.
The Pagans Motorcycle Club formed out of the rebellious post-World War II era and belongs to the Big Four clubs in the United States, including the Hells Angels, the Banditos, and the Outlaws. The Outlaw Motorcycle Club was a designation that formed in the 1940s and 50s as a way to characterize motorcycle clubs who weren't in the American Motorcyclist Association but weren't necessarily actively engaged in criminal activity. This definition has shifted with time as members of said clubs try to model themselves around an outlaw image and have been actively engaged in murder, drug trafficking, and even cybercrime as the decades came along. The Pagans were formed in 1959 by then 18-year-old Lou Dobkin, a resident of Maryland, who came together with 12 friends, adopted denim jackets as a uniform, and began joining the outlaw motorcyclist world. Over time, the group formed a real organizational structure with a leader at the top, an organization of higher-ups known as the Mother Club under him, chapter presidents known as Diamonds, chapter members, and prospects or potential members. Dobkin was paid $100,000 a year as the group's national president, and was, for the most part, engaged in simple bike riding and bar fighting until the mid-1960s and early 70s, when John Marin, aka Satan, took control of the Pagans and grew their membership to several thousand members. Their strongest base remained in Pennsylvania, between Philadelphia and the central part of the state, and the greater New England area. Marin, a resident of Marcus Hook, Philadelphia, had originally been the leader of the Sons of Satan, but switched to the Pagans after befriending then Pagans leader Fred Burhans, aka Dutch, and eventually took over the club with the help of Marcus Hook resident Glenn Joseph Turner. Turner's father was a wealthy businessman who owned businesses like a scrapyard and car shop that made Turner quickly popular within the Pagans. By the late 70s, the group had become a full-blown drug-producing and trafficking organization that had been involved in several acts of violence that put its top men behind bars. Marin ordered an attack on March 9, 1974, on a small local club in Richmond, Virginia, named the Confederate Angels, allies of the Hells Angels. The attack led to a man getting murdered at the clubhouse and 2 others being mutilated. On March 25th, 1982, Turner, while on parole, left a motel in Gloucester City in a Cadillac with 2 motorcycles flanking his sides, and was pulled over by State Trooper John B. Jacobs, who Turner proceeded to shoot in the face. In 1988, Keith Richter, aka Conan the Barbarian, the leader of the Pagans in Long Island, New York, attempted to murder an officer and received 16 years. Conan was released in 2012, however, and took over the gang in 2018, easing the membership requirements and spreading it out across the East Coast. From his home base in Long Island, he led the Pagans on a wild spree of violence up and down the region, leading to beatings and shootings. He also decided to make a change to the gang's uniform, adding East Coast on the backs of their shirts as a way to signify that the region was his. The Pagans quickly became one of the country's most powerful and successful biker clubs due to their lack of a real headquarters and lack of professionalism and normalization within the US society, unlike their rivals, the Hells Angels. The feud between the Angels and the Pagans has culminated in attacks, beatings, and murders across Pennsylvania and New England, as well as several failed plots to bomb rivals, and almost always is centered in regions that suddenly see a new Hells Angels presence, like in Philadelphia, where they arrived in 2002 after the arrest of Stephen Mondevergine, aka the Gorilla, in 2001, who was the leader of the Pagans in Philadelphia. On February 23rd, 2002, a motorcycle expo named the Hellraiser's Ball in Long Island was raided by Pagans who swarmed Hells Angels members, getting into brutal fights as guns popped off inside the venue. The event, sponsored by the Angels, had been posted on their website publicly. 100 Pagans then loaded into several vans and drove by. Patrons, most of whom weren't affiliated with biker clubs, ducked down as shots went back and forth. A van outside was sprayed with Uzi gunfire. 11 men were beaten, stabbed, and injured, and 1 Pagan was shot dead. The quiet, peaceful community of Plainview turned into a massive crime scene as officers searched in cruisers and helicopters, arresting 60 bikers that day. 2 weeks later, in retaliation, a Pagan-owned tattoo shop in South Philadelphia was firebombed. On January 1st, 2005, 3 Hells Angels were seen recruiting Pagans to switch clubs at the Woodshed Bar in Philadelphia when a group of Pagans attacked and beat them. One of the Pagans who had been successfully recruited into the Hells Angels was Thomas Wood, aka Thinker, Mondevergine's sergeant-at-arms, who became the vice president of the Philadelphia Hells Angels. On January 14, 2005, Thinker left the Cheerleaders strip bar on South Front Street in a gray pickup truck, followed along by a friend on a motorbike. At around 1:30 a.m., as they drove down the Schuylkill Expressway, Pagans members in a white Chevy pulled up and opened fire on the man in the bike. Thinker then put his truck in the way to stop the gunfire, and in the process was shot dead as his car sped down the road and came to a stop. In 2010, things popped off in Long Island yet again between both clubs. 2 ATF agents, including experienced undercover agent Ken Croke, had infiltrated the Suffolk County branch of the gang in late 2008, with Croke even rising up to become a sergeant-at-arms or second-in-command. John Ebling, the president of the Long Island chapter, rose up to become a member of the Mother Club, and in May of 2010, as Croke was undercover, Ebling's position was taken by Jonathan Blair as the president of Long Island. Croke saw all kinds of violence within the gang, including prospects being beaten in the street and at Mobo's Bar and Grill, a pagan clubhouse, as well as receiving beatings himself. In the fallout of an August 2009 beating of a pagan by a Hells Angel, a plot formed in mid-2010 to murder several Hells Angels members in Long Island by chucking hand grenades at them on the street. A meeting was held at Ebling's Tattoo Parlor in Rocky Point, Long Island, which was the main headquarters for the Pagans' Suffolk County operations. Croke taped the call as Ebling explained that the Pagans were far outnumbered in Long Island and had to attack with heavier artillery from afar, hence the idea of lobbing homemade grenades and nail bombs. At a national Pagans meeting in the Philadelphia area in New Jersey shortly afterwards, the Pagans declared war against the Hells Angels and told their members to be ready to die or go to jail at any time. Croke's operation had to come to an end, and on September 15, 2010, police rounded up 20 Pagans in Central Islip and White Plains, including Ebling and Blair, and at Blair's home in Holbrook, agents discovered a dormant nail bomb hidden in a safe. Police served warrants on several residences, took in 34 guns, and loads of cocaine and oxycodone. Following the raids in 2010, things changed in Long Island. This was the second time in just 10 years that law enforcement had dismantled the Pagans' control over Long Island in a broad sweep, allowing the Hells Angels to exert even more control. Word was going around that they planned to invade New Jersey, which for the longest time had been strict pagan territory. When Keith Richter took over the Pagans in 2018, however, he countered this and began a campaign of force on the East Coast to enforce the Pagans' presence in the region. The man he put in charge of this new campaign was Robert Durand, aka Hellboy, the leader of the Pagans hit squad in Long Island. Durand had clicked up with the Pagans in Long Island in 2009, standing at 5'11" and ready to fight at any time. He was given the nickname Hellboy due to his pretense for violence and the fact that his face turned red when he became mad. Before the raids in September of 2010, Durand had become the chapter president of Ocean County and Elizabeth, New Jersey. He structured a crew in Ocean County, which in the past didn't have much of a biker presence, and eventually became the president of the Pagans in New Jersey. Police believe that Durand was involved in over 15 attacks and murders during his rise, and became involved with the Philadelphia Mafia in drug dealing and debt collection. The Pagans' history within the Mafia in Philadelphia can be traced all the way back to the 1970s, when John Marin, who lived in Marcus Hook, took over the club. There were problems over meth dealing businesses in the 80s as the Pagans refused to pay a drug tax to the Philadelphia Mafia, then controlled by Nicodemo Scarfo, who wanted to control the meth business in Philadelphia. In 1984, Salvatore Merlino, the second in command of Scarfo's Mafia, a position known as a Sottocapo or Vicecapo, drove his Mercedes in a drunken rage into a Harley-Davidson bike owned by a pagan, which exasperated tensions. By 1989, however, Scarfo received a life-in-prison sentence, and from there, John Stanfa, a Sicilian-born member of the New York Gambino Mafia family, became the boss. Under Stanfa was Joseph Merlino, Salvatore Merlino's son, who, unlike his father, forged stronger connections with the Pagans biker club. Stephen Mondevergian was the leader of the Philadelphia Pagans, getting his start in the early 80s as a cop who was fired for taking bribes from Mafia gambling clubs.
Morning began with a viewing for 31-year-old Michael Cinglini at a funeral home on South Broad Street. Most of the 75 to 100 people who showed up weren't talking to reporters. The few who were basically said,
"A wonderful father."
But the Pennsylvania Crime Commission says this husband and father of three was also involved in a faction of the Philadelphia mob. Cinglini and another man, 31-year-old reputed mobster Joseph Merlino, were ambushed last Thursday in the 600 block of Catherine Street in South Philadelphia by two gunmen. The assassin's getaway car was found burning a short time later.
Between 1992 and 1994, Joseph Merlino and John Stanfa went to war, taking turns employing their armies of soldiers to shoot and kill one another, and in several instances, Merlino himself pulled the trigger. The violence in South Philadelphia ended in March of 1994 when an official Mafia member Stanfa had inducted, John Vesey, became a government informant. Vesey, along with Philip Coletti, had tried to drive-by murder Merlino on August 5th, 1993, instead injuring him and killing his friend Michael Ciangalini, who'd already survived the shooting earlier that year. Stanfa needed as many men as possible under his wing, as there weren't many hardened Italian gangsters out on the streets following Scarfo's life sentence in 1989, leading to him making men who arguably wouldn't have been made in better circumstances, including Vesey and his brother William, aka Billy. At the end of 1993, police were on Vesey's tail after the shooting of Ciangalini, and in January of 1994, he and Billy became wired informants, as Stanfa's second-in-command and third-in-command, Frank Martinez and Vincent Pagano, weren't paying John Vesey for his murder jobs and were providing him with old guns in poor shape. Stanfa then ordered Martinez and Pagano to kill Vesey. On January 14, 1994, the two led Vesey to an apartment in South Philly to discuss a potential promotion. He sat with Pagano at a desk. Although Martinez was nowhere to be found, they spoke, and Martinez leapt out of a bathroom behind Vesey and shot him 3 times with a .22 caliber pistol. Vesey, somehow unfazed by the shots, stood up, beat Martinez, and left for the hospital. In March, Stanfa, Martinez, Pagano, and most of his side of the organization were arrested by the FBI, allowing Merlino and Ralph Natale to fill in the void. Natale would later turn state's witness against Merlino, but Merlino stayed true to the mob and stayed as the head of Philadelphia moving forwards. This was good for Mondevergine, and the Pagans in Philadelphia did fairly well. In 1998, Mondevergine got into conflict with a local Philadelphia Italian gang named the 10th and Oregon Crew, who had originally gotten into conflict with Joey Merlino after a nightclub beating sent their leader, Louis Tura, to the hospital. Tura, his father Anthony, and members of the 10th and Oregon Crew planned retaliation against Merlino.
After they leave home, knock on the door, tell you to salesman. That's all. We got a new salesman there. Remember me? Boom.
When he was in the house, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, the cops are going to leave from there, and they're not going to watch the house. They're going to leave. That's when you just dump them grenades right in there with a couple of explosives and blow that. You can't hit it, see it come.
But in August of 1997, they were arrested for drug trafficking and conspiracy to commit murder. On January 7, 1998, Louis Tura was hung from the ceiling of his holding cell, and on March 18, Anthony was gunned down while sitting on a wheelchair in his driveway. After the Tura family's departure, 10th and Oregon was led by Eugene Miller, aka Genie Boy, who, like the Turas before him, refused to pay Joey Merlino's Mafia extortion payments. It was also reported that he'd disrespected a Pagan member's girlfriend. On February 28, 1999, a group of Pagans stormed Miller's bar in South Philadelphia, beat 5 members of the Oregon Crew, and shot Miller. Mondevergine was called to a peace meeting in 1999 between him, Merlino, and John Hendry, aka Johnny the Hat, from the Oregon Crew, but it led to no conclusion. On August 29, Mondevergine was attacked as he left a bar, shot 8 times at close range. A year later, November 3rd, 2000, he chased John Hendry to the Oregon Diner on Oregon Avenue and shot twice, but missed. Mondevergine was arrested in 2001. The Angels attempted to move in, leading to the murder of Thinker Wood and their subsequent departure from Philadelphia. When Mondevergine was released from prison in the 2000s, he attempted to rally support against the Hells Angels, but Timothy Flood, aka Casual Tim, disagreed with Mondevergine's methods and formed a crew of loyalists to protest his leadership. On January 3rd, 2008, Casual Tim called for a vote of Pagans to kick Mondevergine out as leader of the Philadelphia chapter, leading to Mondevergine storming a Pagans clubhouse, kneecapping Tim with a handgun, and stabbing him in the back. In 2009, Casual Tim became a federal informant after being charged in a multi-state trafficking bust and began supplying information on the Pagans to the FBI. He gave information on Mondevergine stabbing him as well, and police chased the Pagans boss to his mother's home in 2010, where he was arrested and extradited back to Philadelphia. Mondevergine received 3 to 10 years in August of 2011, while Casual Tim ended up going into witness protection in 2010, and when Mondevergine was released from prison in 2014, he took over the Philadelphia Pagans yet again. As for Robert Durand, he was put in charge of forming a pagan hit squad, a crew of pagans in Long Island, simply there to kill any target given to them. When Keith Richter began his campaign against smaller local biker gangs and the Hells Angels, Durand was commanded to lead the charge that ended up with Hells Angel Jeffrey Shank getting a vicious beating on April 24, 2018. That afternoon, Shank left the Hells Angels clubhouse in Newark, New Jersey, and stopped at a gas station to fill up his bike. Suddenly, Durand, Louis Sirocco, aka Lou Rock, and Maurice Guzman, aka Dog, pulled in on a pickup truck, exited, and struck Shank in the head with a metal baseball bat, but Shank's helmet protected him. Hellboy continued beating his rival with the bat when one pagan with a pipe also began beating Shank. Durand received 4 years in prison for the attack, but was released within a year after the coronavirus ravaged New Jersey's prison system in 2020. In 2020 would be the same year that Francisco Rosado would tragically lose his life.
Angel's New York City chapter has moved its headquarters to this quiet Throgs Neck neighborhood. Across the street from the water views, the old American Legion building shows signs that the biker group has already moved in and decorated. But the signage doesn't bother neighbor Alejandro Coban. It's the sound of revving motorcycles.
Bikes aren't silent. They don't go room, room, nice and, low.
But not everyone on this street agrees. Most messages responding to the move on a community board Facebook page offer support, even suggesting this will be the safest block in the Bronx.
It's a quiet neighborhood, but, things are changing, and I really believe it'll be safer.
This Hells Angels chapter spent over 50 years in the East Village, but not without incident. In 2016, one member was charged after shooting a man, prosecutors say, over a parking dispute.
So what happens today, they take my parking, and I feel like, you know what, and I'm gonna go and park my car in front of them. I'm gonna get shot.
Now, it is worth noting that shooting incident from 2016 charges were dropped when the accused shooter unexpectedly passed away. Now, as for residents here, they do tell me candidly that they've been surprised quite pleasantly to find a few Hell Angels knocking door to door, introducing themselves, getting familiar with their new neighbors. The council member's office and spokesperson tells me that it was a fully private transaction, completely on the up and up, and there was no reason for them to check in with their office.
Things between the Angels and the Pagans came to a head in late 2019 when the Hells Angels finally moved out of their longtime headquarters on 77 East 3rd Street in East Village, Manhattan, to buy a new location on 241 Longstreet Avenue, a much larger building. The issue was that the new building, once an American Legion post sold for $1.25 million, was in Throgs Neck, prime pagan territory. The sale of the Angels' Manhattan clubhouse netted them $8 million, and so to add insult to injury, they bought several more properties in Throgs Neck as well. The once quiet, middle-class neighborhood became the site of loud, late-night motorcycle riding and yelling. Parties were being held until long hours of the night, and the Pagans had to step in and do something. And they did so on January 2nd, 2020, when a gang of motorcyclists drove up to the building and shot it 14 times. Defacing the facade, the Angels retaliated in the most violent way they knew, to kill, and their bullets found themselves in Francisco Rosado's head. For the job to go successfully, the Angels formed a hit crew comprising of 3 men: Frank Tatuli, a longtime Hells Angel nicknamed Loose Cannon, Sayanon Tongtawath, a 30-year-old nicknamed Andy, and Anthony DeStefano, a member of Lesser MC Satan's Soldiers, who worked for the Angels and wanted to rise within them using Rosado's murder. They knew Rosado was the super for a residential property on Holland Avenue in Allerton, where he lived as well, and that's in fact where he would be on the afternoon of May 2nd, 2020, just after 3 p.m. Rosado was one of many gangsters operating out of Allerton, including the violent 1300 gang, who control the Parkside housing project in the northwestern part of the neighborhood. Rosado portrayed his gang affiliation proudly with several face tattoos, and of course, his leather Pagan's jacket. He stood outside his home on Holland Avenue at around 3:20 p.m. that day when a distinct retro blue Jeep drove up carrying Thongtawat and Tatuli. The pair exited the car wielding pistols and charged Rosado, shooting him several times and dropping him on the sidewalk. Also injured in the shooting was Rosado's friend Javier Cruz, who stood next to him on the sidewalk. and a civilian woman who was shot in the spray of gunfire. Police tracked the 20-minute path of the Jeep as it left the scene of the shooting to a car lot where the two masked gunmen exited and entered Tutuli's pickup truck, which police then also followed, leaving the parking lot. Police served warrants on Tutuli, Thongtawat, and De Stefano in July, finding clothing items from the shooting in Tutuli's home. New Jersey pagans Larry Ortiz, aka Savage, and Junius Aquino, aka J.O., then began their own campaign against the Hells Angels in the Garden State as retaliation. On October 21st, 2020, Aquino and several pagans were attacked by bat-wielding angels outside a bar in Verona, New Jersey, and a week later, Aquino and Ortiz sped down the Jersey Turnpike and opened fire on a Hells Angel driving down the road, injuring him as his car came to a stop. Police began an undercover investigation into both bikers, naming Aquino as the chapter president of Elizabeth, New Jersey, and raiding him on November 5th, 2020, after he opened fire on a vehicle in Elizabeth, half a week after the Turnpike shooting. Police in Jersey raided his home and took him in, and Ortiz was arrested 12 days later, named as the leader of the Jersey City Pagans. Following the arrests of Aquino and Ortiz, there have been no recorded major acts of violence between the Angels and the Pagans in the region.